We are live, another extra expert restaurant roundup. Getting my words tied there. I've got a professor who's going to critique some stuff in the restaurant space with some safety, some cleaning, and good things like that. And probably, because he got all those books behind him, critique my lack of English a minute ago. So Nathan, welcome to the Expert Restaurant Roundup. Let us know who you are, where you're from, and all that good stuff.
Thank you. I appreciate being on your show today. I appreciate the invitation. So I am originally from Houston, Texas, and I basically got almost all my industry experience in that market. I started working in restaurants when I was in my early teens, and I've done everything from concessions to catering, front of the house, back of the house, although primarily back of the house, mostly pastries, although I've done some catering. And at one point I owned a gluten-free bakery that sold through farmers markets. So I've seen a lot of the industry, and was fortunate to get a degree from the University of Houston's College of Hotel and Restaurant Management. That was my bachelor's, and ultimately, through a number of events, I ended up with a PhD in food science and food safety from the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville, Arkansas. So what I really like to do, kind of my specialty, is to be the center of hospitality and culinary and food science and food safety, and bring those things together, marry them for my students, for operators, and for my clients.
Okay, well, I've got an important question. You said, I know you worked on the pastry world, and you said you were a pastry chef at some point. Do you like Pop-Tarts?
I have been known to eat a Pop-Tart or two,
okay.
Yes.
So here's a very important question. Do you toast your Pop-Tarts, or do you eat them right out of the wrapper?
I'm a right out of the wrapper kind of guy.
Gosh, a part of me just died.
I
had this conversation the other day with a friend of mine. I probably every other weekend I'll have Pop-Tarts with my coffee on the weekend. That's like my guilty pleasure. I don't eat breakfast typically, but if I do, I'll have that. And a buddy of mine was talking about it, and he said he occasionally doesn't pop his. I'm like, it's called a Pop-Tart. It's meant to pop out of a toaster. Like, you're not letting the Pop-Tart live its life correctly, but it's a different topic.
Yeah, indeed. Guilty pleasures of former cooks.
There you go. So I know you, and my team knows you. They found you through the Restaurant Relevance podcast. So talk about the podcast and what got you to start it.
So about 2.5 years ago, I had seen some people doing podcasts, but I saw that there really wasn't anyone talking about hospitality, and particular restaurant research, so academic research at the university level, and how it applied to restaurants and operators. And I love that intersection of, here's academic, here's operations, and how do we bring them together? And no one was doing that. I ended up actually helping a friend put together a podcast for my alumni association. And through that, really got into the fun conversations that podcasts can be. And so I thought, you know what, I'm just going to do it. And so I guess over a year and a few months ago, I contacted a bunch of professors all around the world that do restaurant research. And I said, I'm starting this podcast. My goal is to apply your research for operators, nerding out along the way. And I had some respondents say yes. I actually had a great response. And so last year, I had 14 episodes, all related to food service research. From things talking about modernist cuisine to talking about food safety, how to handle allergens in restaurants, to how pastry chefs share information on Instagram, and does that dilute their brand, etc. So just really fun conversations, and I'm looking forward to starting my season 2. Should release here in the next couple of weeks.
I love it. I want to show you something when we get to the end here and get your feedback on it then from a marketing standpoint of research, because we've done a little bit of that, and I'm always intrigued by it. But what got my attention on your podcast was that, by the way, your podcast is put together and more well thought out than a lot of podcasts, number one. So I appreciate what you do there.
Thank you.
Excellent job. Guys like me fly by the seat of our pants, and guys like you actually plan what you're going to say. And so I appreciate that when I hear it, because it relates to me well. I'm like, hey, I should do that more. But what caught my attention was, episode 5 last year, right. And there was a whole conversation there, but it also, why I like podcasting is it gets me thinking with how it relates to me and my business and how, we deal with restaurants and, the perceived food safety in restaurants, delivery, and at home. And what kind of how I unpack that is that, 5 years ago, the majority of what I did from a standpoint as a consumer, eat out, and I'm sure the rest of the country, was you ate at restaurants or you went through a drive-through or picked something up and went home.
Right.
And it was pretty simple. Yeah, you had the pizza places that delivered pizza, but you know what? You trusted them because they've been delivering pizzas forever. Well, now all of a sudden you flash forward. I think this episode was recorded, I want to say last summer, right? 2021?
Correct.
And so you're a year and a half into the pandemic, and you've got a lot of restaurants that all of a sudden weren't accustomed to having their own delivery drivers. And I know a couple that did. And I was kind of like, man, I would have outsourced that because you don't do a great job of running that part. I couldn't imagine how the delivery's going. And then you got third party where you've got these. I saw a lady walk in a restaurant the other day, no lie. And I'm not saying this is how third party is, but she walked in like pajamas, like Scooby-Doo pajamas. And I'm a Scooby-Doo guy. I'm more of a Scrappy-Doo. And I was just like looking, I'm like, wow, if you're going to go to the door of somebody's house, you're the brand of that restaurant now, but different topic. But it got me thinking about that food is now in a lot of different hands, whereas it might not have been back then. So talk about some of the things you've noticed there, or you've seen, or you've heard with regards to what consumers take from that.
Yeah. So as you mentioned, right, you've got multiple channels now, right? People can walk in and take it out, or the restaurant can deliver it themselves, or you've got third party. Consumers' perceptions of the food safety issues, but also the brand issues, as you kind of alluded to, have really changed from before the pandemic through the pandemic. And I think they're continuing to change. I'll admit the continuing to change part is really anecdotal. I haven't seen the data on that yet, but watching consumer behavior, people's perceptions of what is safe or not are changing. So the episode you're referring to, I was talking to Dr. Karen Bird, and their research suggested that consumers felt safer, or felt that the food was safer, when the restaurant delivered their own food rather than having a third party service do this. Now, they didn't get into why exactly that was. They're doing more research, and so we would hope to see those results here in the next year. But my guess is that some of it comes down to what you alluded to a moment ago, right? A third-party delivery driver could be wearing anything, right? They could be wearing, a T-shirt branded to your competitor to show up and deliver your food, or something that's inappropriate, according to the guests, et cetera, right? You have no idea.
Could be a hungry college kid.
Right. Yes. And as we were talking about right before we started, right? If the restaurant's not using a sticker or a staple or something to close that, we've all heard stories of delivery drivers taking a sample, along the way. And so the guest only gets half the fries, et cetera. So I believe, based on the research I've seen and kind of my gut intuition, that a lot of it comes down to those stories, and that guests like building relationships with individual operations.
Yep.
Right. Restaurant operators like loyal guests as well. And I know that's much of what your company does is trying to drive loyal guests. Well, that relationship is important to the guests as well. And so I believe that builds a level of trust and familiarity. And familiarity is also important because the research that Dr. Bird talked about in that episode also showed that consumers most trust the food that they prepare. Right. And again, they didn't do the research exactly why. I think it has to do with familiarity, more control over the process. Right. Well, a restaurant that they're interacting with, they place the order with you, they talk to your host on the phone, or they used your app, they're familiar with it. And so when you deliver it, there's kind of uniformity there in brand, and that leads to familiarity and greater trust.
Yeah. No, I agree. And I've seen some informal surveys, and we've seen restaurants that we've worked with across the country that'll do surveys and ask that question. And some of the feedback I remember early on, I mean, that most restaurants I know doing third party right now weren't doing it before the pandemic. And heck, I remember a couple of them. My whole my whole tie to third party was it's a marketing ploy that if you've got a restaurant and somebody's on there and they're using a third party app and they see your place and they might not have chose you, it's a way to maybe get them to try your food and then have something, the correct marketing in the bag to get them to come to you direct next time. But a lot of the places that we dealt with when they started doing third party, a couple of things I saw that they put in place, and one of the restaurants was genius for doing this. But a couple of things I saw early on was that they weren't familiar with it on their own. They weren't familiar with delivery at all. I mean, because think about who delivered food 10 years ago was pizza places.
Yep.
Burger places weren't delivering food. Wing places weren't delivering food. And so I remember talking to an operator up in New York one time, a guy named Matthew Borowski, 618 was New Jersey, and the name of his restaurant. And he said one of the first things he did was when they started doing third party was he went to a friend's house and had his friend order the third party and ordered a ton of food. He said, because number one, I knew if my name was on the order, they would be like, they'd see who it was. Oh, he's mystery shopping us. But he said, I wanted to see how everything traveled. He's like, they had to probably think that this is an insane hungry person because they ordered so much off the menu. But he said, I found it real quick that certain items are like fries are a terrible one that travel with most restaurants.
Yeah.
And I'll never forget, I always go back to the equation of like understanding your product and the perception, because that might backfire if somebody does find you on third party, orders your food, and what gets to their house sucks. They might never come to your restaurant.
Right.
And I always go back to a little informal survey I did. One of my friends and a client a long time ago was wanting to put a restaurant, his brand, in the Cincinnati Bengals stadium down here where we're at. And I happened to be going to Pittsburgh, and he said, hey, do me a favor, go to the Steelers game and try out the food at the concession stand. There's one of our franchisees has a location there. And so I went, and the product was night and day. I had his product 100 times. I had it there. I'm like, dude, if that was my first interaction with the brand, I would never go to the brick and mortar. And so I think that's a big thing too, with regards to consumers, that you've got to pay attention to what's happening. And then with your product, but the other one, which, a lot of people were doing early on, was the security of the bag, was putting the sticker on it, stapling it, having products that that kid that delivered your food or that person didn't have 2 wings and 20 fries on their way there.
Right. And I think there's some ways that you could take that a step further, where but we were talking before about whether it's a QR code, right? That QR code could even take you to, maybe that's a custom QR code to your ticket, right? To what should be in the bag, or
I like that.
QR code. Maybe the QR code gets printed and attached when the delivery driver shows up, so it's now time stamped, and so the guest could actually take a picture of it and see how long it took. There are ways that QR codes could be reused in some really clever ways. Now, I say this, and this is just an aside. I also recently saw that criminals are now using QR codes on flyers and things and tricking people to click QR codes, and then it downloads malware on their phones, etc. So anytime there's a good opportunity for operators, there will be a criminal out there that tries to abuse it. But I think QR codes or something like it are valuable in that regards. There's something else you said that really kind of sparked a thought, and that was, you were talking about your friend that had ordered a whole bunch of things to see how his food traveled. When I was working in restaurants, one of my chefs, and I don't remember who to attribute this to, said, when you're designing a new plate, often cooks in particular, but even chefs, will prepare it and take a couple of bites, taste it, say, oh, this is great, right? And put it on the menu. But you really need to prepare the entire plate and sit down and eat the entire plate just like a guest would, right? Experience the food in the way the guests will. I think you can translate that to the delivery experience. You need to experience, or the app experience, right? Download the app that's using it and try to figure out how easy it is to enter information, or assume something goes wrong and try to enter a complaint and see what happens. Right. I think one of the biggest problems with third party is that complaints, it's this weird middle ground, because the guest wants to complain to the restaurant, but the restaurant usually has no control over that process. Sometimes doesn't even know who the guest was.
Yep.
And so there's lots of issues there. And so finding a way to maybe use third party, as you said, to gain a new guest with some select menu items that perform really well in third party delivery, but then find a way to capture that information and convert them from third party to in-house as quickly as possible is what I, advise operators to do. And there's another option, and that is there are a couple of co-ops out there, restaurant co-ops that are putting together their own delivery co-op. So in one sense, it acts like a third party. It's got the scale of a third party, but the restaurant owners are somehow part of the management of it. And
I think Denver has a big one.
Yes. And there's a couple more. And of course, off the top of my mind, I can't remember. I'd have to look it up, but they've had some good success because no research has been done. But I think what they're finding is guests are viewing it as an extension of the restaurant because they know the restaurants are involved. The restaurants have more say and buy-in and investment than just a company does. So I think there's some other options. If a restaurant feels like, well, it's just too much to do it on my own, there may be some other options without just, selling out to the third party option.
Yep. And one of the listeners, Suzanne, said that she does mystery shopping for restaurants. And it's interesting. My wife used to do mystery shopping for restaurants back early in my marketing career. She had signed up for a service with, I can't think of the name of the company, but for whatever reason, she always got Buffalo Wild Wings. That was what was always given to her. And so we would go once a week and we would go in and she had to order certain things. Like she had to order an alcoholic drink. She had to order the wings, this, and then each time it would come out maybe a different item to order, different dessert, different items. And it was pretty unique to see and just see how she would submit it. And they would reimburse her. That's what it was. It wasn't not even paid. It was just reimbursing the meal. So we looked at it from a standpoint, okay, we get to eat free one time a week. But I think it's a huge thing. And that's one thing we're actually starting to do with our company is mystery shop our own company, because I had a consultant that we recently hired who mystery shopped us, who came in as an opportunity for us to work with him. And then in the meantime, between meeting 1 and meeting 2, he mystery shopped us, and we came on meeting 2 and we're sitting there talking. And he said, hey, by the way, I want to be transparent. I went through your sales process. I went through an appointment with 2 of your people. I'm like, oh, seriously? And he's like, yeah. And the intel I got was like, wow. Like we found some things that were great, found some things that weren't great. And I'm like, well, man, I mean, I can't imagine your experience is unique. I mean, every one of these, I think that's a huge deal. And this brings me to my last one. I don't know why this popped up in my head, but it did the other night, because you're talking about part of the thing with me when I was thinking about the food safety is like, I look at restaurants, and when I walk into restaurants, I make assumptions on what they're paying attention to if they're not taking care of certain stuff. A good example, my son just went on 6 college trips, and I went on 4 of the 6. And the college I think he's probably going to pick, which 9 out of 10, every element, gorgeous campus. I mean, giant building, just great, small school. Their landscaping had weeds everywhere, and there's no mulch. And I'm like looking around, and the place is immaculate, but I'm thinking, how did this happen? The guy get fired? But I mean, it's not a huge deal with regards to his education, but to me, it's a detail, because I'm wondering, like, how do you have this $40 million science building, but nobody has put mulch in this bed and picked weeds for a year? But anyway, so I'm walking in a restaurant the other night, and their flower pot, which was apparently supposed to look good out front, had turned into an ashtray for a couple of nice consumers. And so for my part, I one think, what a jackass consumer. Like, that's obviously a flower pot. Like, if you're going to smoke, dispose of your stuff correctly. But number 2, it also makes me wonder, like, because you could tell they had been there for about 3 or 4 days, at least, probably even longer than that. Also made me think that owner, have you walked through your front door lately? Have you looked around? Because when I go to businesses, some of the things, the assumptions I make, like, I see that. And if I've never been to that restaurant before, a consumer might see that and go, yeah, I'm going to just turn around and go the other way, because if they can't pay attention to this trash in their front yard or this happening, I'm just going to go the other way.
Yep. No, I mean, I think that insight is well taken. And so actually 2 of my classes, one of my students' main assignments is to choose an operation. In one class, it's a beverage class, so it has to be an operation that serves alcohol. And another class, it's just any operation. And they have to visit. They don't have to purchase anything, although they could. And they have to look for operational things like that. But I have them make observations. What does it smell like? Can you hear the kitchen? Can you smell the bathroom or chemicals? Those types of things. The goal is to train them to be that type of an operator that is being observant, because if you're not observing those things, your guests will, or at least some of them will. And I think that's a valuable skill. It's not something that most people pick up on automatically. There are a few, but I think it's something that has to be taught. It's a type of attention to detail. And I think it also ties back into how much pride and really ownership you take over the operation. And maybe not even the operation. If it's a shift lead or something, it could just be over your shift, and treating it kind of like, it's yours and you have guests coming almost into your home.
Yeah. Oh, we were filming at a franchise restaurant one time, and the CEO was coming in to be involved with it. And I had got there early, and I had him turn the music down inside because we were there before hours, but they had the store ready. I mean, they opened the store in his restaurants. He happens to own that particular franchise as well, be the CEO of the company, of the franchisor. And when he walks in, I loved it because I met him outside and we shot a little stand up in front of the restaurant. And then we walked in, then we sat down and had a conversation. And when we were outside walking in, like I could see his eyes, and he went right to this flyer, which made sense. They had posted this flyer on the outside of the door. So it's going to get wet the next day when it rains. And then he also didn't like, because I hate tape. I want tape hidden. And he didn't like how the tape was on the corners, which I got a kick out because I'm the same way. And we walk in the restaurant, and we had already been set up, and he walks in and he's like, why is the music not at the right level? And he goes back to tell them. And I'm like, no, we had them turn it down he's like, okay, cool. But he had recognized immediately, he walked in and he was on alert. So it's key. It's very important. And it comes up. So I want to show you something, and I hadn't planned on this, but I want to get your feedback because you're the research guy. So let me click this button, and this should show. Can you see my screen okay?
Yeah.
So let me take this background off real quick. This will cover it up more. So what this is, our company, when about 5-6 years ago, I created a thing called an attention audit. And when restaurants would reach out looking for advice, I would have a certain number of questions I would ask them on the first call. And then I would also research so I could come back to them and analyze, like, 1, you don't need us. 2, you need us. But I would also be prepared, like, here's the opportunities I see or mention. Because for me, I subscribe to the notion of money follows attention. That if your business gets enough attention over, now granted, the right attention, but if your business gets enough attention over and over and over and over, and you have a great product and a great atmosphere and people like eating at your place, they're going to eat more often. Mm-hmm. And so I would do these. Well, January of last year, a lot of my employees, most of us have a web page saved on our phone to where when we go in a restaurant, we do these audits, even if we're just there eating. We'll look, okay, do they have a mobile-friendly website? Do they have this? Well, what happened was back in December, one of our employees was like, hey, all the data from that, we only judge it on a one-to-one basis. Have you ever put it together? I said, what do you mean? They said, well, like, we're all about data because we have huge dashboards with regards to tracking stuff for clients. What do those look like globally? So it was saved. It was kind of fortunate. It was every response goes to a Google sheet.
There you go.
So we got all this data. And so we went through and we created this dashboard, and it was kind of comical because I had never looked at this data at a global. I had always looked at this from a standpoint of what it looks like one-off. And so, like, the numbers, the 6 things we look at are, does your restaurant have a mobile-friendly website? Which, to me, how it's 2022 and every restaurant doesn't have that is absolutely ludicrous. But literally,
agreed.
20, and this gets updated by whenever, if 50 of my employees today were to fill out one right now, it would change these numbers.
Oh, neat.
But, So 25% of restaurants don't have a mobile friendly website. And what we gauge as mobile friendly is, number one, you don't have a PDF at your menu. You got it easy to order. The second part to me, because I'm a big data person, is there a tool on your website that's collecting data outside of purchase? Because there's a lot of tire kickers that come to a restaurant's website to see what you got going on. Right. And if there's not an ethical bribe to say, hey, we want you, like somebody might be on Uber Eats and then actually go to your website to see what's all about. The in-store data gathering tool, like you walk into a restaurant, is there something in there that seamlessly allows the consumer to interact with the restaurant's database? The fourth one is, do they ask? The number one question that is asked in restaurants as the very first experience of every consumer.
I mean, I would say it was, do you want to join the mailing list?
How are you doing?
First question. Got it.
Yeah. Nuanced question. Nobody actually cares. It's the thing we see. Hey, how you doing? Hey, how you doing? Yeah. And so one thing we're on a path to teach restaurants is to stop saying, how are you doing? Because you don't care. The consumer doesn't care. Ask them something. Have you been here before? No, I've never been here. Okay. Well, before we get any farther, you got to join our program and get a free dessert your next visit. So are you asking people? Because that's the most valuable person, is the person walking in your restaurant.
Right.
Do they utilize automation? We're all accustomed to automation with the Amazons and with the auto companies. When you go online and look for a car and you get cyber stalked for 2 weeks on that white Chevy Suburban. And then the last part is social media engagement, is most restaurants are leveraging social media as an advertising tool versus what it was built for, which is an engagement tool. And so these are the stats. I thought you might enjoy this. I can send you a link to it. It's americasbestrestaurants.com/stats. But it's every time we audit a restaurant, the stats go in here. And it's just interesting to see. I look at it and say restaurants, I have a term, one of my books I'm writing, it's called Outsmart or Outspend. And I say, well, you better start outspending your competitors, because you're sure as hell not outsmarting them based on these stats.
Yeah. Yeah. And even the outspend part, I would think for independents could be quite a challenge.
Yeah. It's impossible.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, if you're a local restaurant and you got a Raising Cane's a block away from you, their brand equity, you're never going to outspend, because people are excited it's coming there and they're waiting. Their financial resources, when they build up to 5, 6, 7 locations in a market, and they can buy media everywhere. But outsmarting is not hard, because the technology of Facebook and Instagram and YouTube, the bigger brands actually use it worse. We have an example. We use a Papa John's. I don't know if you guys have Papa John's out in Arkansas or not, but Papa John's, based out of Kentucky, 6.7 million fans on Facebook. Their average Facebook post gets 200 engagements out of 6.7 million.
Wow.
Whereas, a pizza restaurant I know of down the street, 5,000 fans, they get 200 engagements on every other Facebook post. So it's like, okay, you have somehow, destroyed the algorithm. So it's not hard to outsmart those people. It just comes down to actually putting in the power and doing it. And that's what we're on a mission. I thought you might like that, because you mentioned research and data, and there's some research.
Yeah. And I would also say, kind of a nuanced side to the outsmart part there is, could also be the relationship part, relationshipping, right? Your guests, the big restaurants, the big chains, they can only do it through technology and automation.
Yep.
Right. And historically, if you were to look at ultra fine dining, that happened by the maitre d', right? And the servers who knew your name when you walked in, they remembered when you had been there, etc. Well, that type of restaurant is few and far between. Times have changed, but I think the independent can use some of the technology to help reduce the labor required, but still keep the personal touch to build those relationships. And I think that's where an independent or a small chain, a small restaurant group can really thrive. It's because they're small enough to do the relationship building, but particularly a restaurant group probably has the money to hire someone that does social media / technology. And so you can kind of bring those two worlds together and make that your competitive edge.
I've got a Texas person. I was looking for the quote that I wrote down. I did a podcast on it the other day. Mattress Mac, I'm sure.
Oh yes.
Yeah. So he had a quote. I watched a video with him the other day. man, I cannot find that. I wrote it in my notes here, but his quote was gold. Apparently he calls 100 customers every day.
Wow.
And he's got to be in his 80s now. And I'm guessing he still does it because this was an interview like a year ago. And he said, I can't out tech the big furniture companies, but I can out touch them. That's what it was. He said, they're all about out teching me. I'm going to out touch them because I'm going to call these people every day. Whatever. I think it was 100. It might be high, but he had some number that every day he personally picks the phone up and calls it. What's up? This is Mattress Mac, and just talks about their experience, what they bought, whatever. But I loved it because you're exactly right. The restaurant's hospitality. And if you're just using your Facebook and Instagram to sell product, you're not going to be able to make a relationship. But if you, like, I encourage restaurants, do podcasts, highlight employees, do things that get people to engage. Now, we just launched a new series this week called "What the Hell Do You Do at ABR?" And that came from jokingly one of our employees. I'm like, you know what? We need to practically preach more. I want you to tell your story. I'm going to mic you up. We're going to start my office. I'm going to walk in here, and I don't want any context, but I'm just going to ask you, what the hell do you do here? And I walked in and said, hey, what the hell do you do here, Lisa? And she's like, okay. And she pulls her computer and she walked through it, and we did a cool little video, and we're going to start doing every week. Those are the things that I think restaurants can do to outsmart. Is that touch point, is they can walk somebody that comes in a restaurant every day. You know what? Why not say, hey, you're in here all the time. Let's go live on Facebook. I want to know who you are. Let's tell the Facebook world who you are.
Yeah. And I would say, I'm sure you're familiar with Gary Vaynerchuk.
Oh yeah. Gary,
and I follow him. I love a lot of his stuff. And one of his phrases is to scale the unscalable. Right. And I think what you just talked about with Mattress Mac is an example of that, right? Is for a guy that owns a massive company with probably millions of customers and, in one sense, quote unquote, far more important things to do.
Yep.
He calls 100 people a day, right? Yep. His own customers. And you can use that and scale that across other ways. I may be misquoting, but I don't think so. I think it's in Danny Meyer's book, Setting the Table. He talks about making his managers call a certain number or contact a certain number of guests a day. And I'm about 95% sure that's the right attribution. It may be someone else, but the idea is the same, that not just the owner, but I think management and can take ownership of this and reach out to guests, new guests, as well as returning guests, to maintain those relationships. And those are really important for, really the success of your restaurant, because returning guests are always cheaper to keep than trying to get a new guest. And so you want to maintain those relationships, and positive word of mouth from loyal guests is far more valuable than almost any other marketing dollar you can spend, at least in my opinion.
And to tie it all back, a big bow on it, think of the power that when you get an Uber Eats order, I've seen them, you have a number, a name, and an email. Like, what would prevent that restaurant from calling them? Hey, I saw that your order was delivered about an hour ago. Did you love it? Was it exactly what you hoped? Obviously, because that's the big thing with the third party. And I say Uber Eats, it could be Postmates or whoever. The big thing with third party is, like you said, there's that gap of the consumer. They're ordering food from your restaurant. And if it arrives, like I had a wing order one time, an hour and a half. And the guy got to my house and came up to the door, had cash in his hand. He was going to give me the money back because I guess he had a family emergency. He went to his house. I could see on the app that he had went the wrong way and was parked for like an hour somewhere.
Oh no.
And I was like, what is going on here? But I'm like, I'm playing this out. I want to see what happens.
Right.
And the wings, the guy's like, I apologize. There's no excuse for what happened. I'm like, dude, you're not giving me any money back. Like, in fact, I could tell you had a bad day. Here's $20. I'm sure the wings are fine. They actually were. They were in a proper container. He said, I got in my car. I had the heat on full blast. And I'm like, you know what, man, life's too short to worry about it. I appreciate the food. We'll survive.
Yeah.
And, but the restaurants are like at that mercy. Mm-hmm. So the consumers have a bad experience. They're going to point the finger at the restaurant, not the third party app. Whereas if maybe that restaurant owner has a thing in place, like you mentioned, Danny Meyer's having those calls, you know what, we can't control there's uncontrollables, and you can't control them. But what if you try to understand and call those customers within 30, 40 minutes of getting that Uber Eats order or Grubhub and say, hey, we saw that you placed a third-party order. Obviously, we're not involved in the delivery, but I wanted to make sure it got there okay. It wouldn't take you a whole lot.
No, not at all. And I'll say, to even kind of take this back to the start of our conversation about food safety, right? Even more so, people care a lot about the safety of their food, right? Because they're going to eat it, and the safety of their loved ones. Okay. And so this plays into food safety. It also plays into, last year, I interviewed a couple of grad students from, I want to say it was the University of Alberta, but forgive me, that may be incorrect. They did a study on food allergen communication in the restaurant.
Oh, yeah.
And what both of kind of the episodes led to, or takeaway, was communicating effectively and regularly with your guests leads to far better outcomes, even if something goes wrong, right?
Yep.
Because you're in communication, you find out if something goes wrong faster, and you can try to fix it, whether it's traditional food safety related, or whether it's allergen related, or even just a perception, right? So going back to your example, right? You see that Postmates has delivered the food, and someone picks up the phone and calls, or even just texts. A lot of restaurants are using text these days, right? Text the guest and say, we saw that your food arrived. It should have been within the time frame. Were there any issues with the order? Did it come out hot? You're building that relationship, but you're also performing a little bit of due diligence there, right? That you care about the guests, and you want to make sure that the food is not only delicious, but also wholesome and good for them. And I mean, you may have experienced this, but many restaurant managers have experienced this. Often when you have a guest that's upset or something is wrong, they just want to be heard.
Yep.
Right. So why not head that off in advance and reach out to them so that they're being heard before they even feel like they need to be heard. Yep. Right. I think that's a really good principle to follow as well.
I love it, man. I've enjoyed our conversation. I appreciate you coming on.
My pleasure. It's been a good conversation. Thank you.
And I dropped in, wherever you find this online, there's links to him, to Nathan on LinkedIn. You can connect, follow what he's doing. And you got the easiest name for me to remember, last name Jarvis, because we use a product called Jarvis for some AI that we do. So I don't know if you can get some trademark infringement on your name there, but it's a good product we use to get a lot of script out of stuff.
Nice. I wish I could get royalties. Unfortunately, Jarvis's is common in England about 100 years ago, as Smith was. Oh. So I have no claims there. But thanks again for having me. Yeah, Restaurant Relevance, the podcast. It's on YouTube. It's also on Spotify and podcast platforms. Would love for you and your listeners to take a look at that. I've got a new season rolled up and going to interview some researchers and talk about what they studied and how it would apply to restaurant operators over the next year.
Love it. Well, I appreciate having you on. Thank you, sir.
All right. Take care.
Bye.